Have you ever felt like you no longer fit in the world you once knew? As if an invisible force is pulling you away from the noise and distractions that once held your attention? Do you find yourself craving solitude not out of sadness or rejection, but because something deep within you recognizes that the most profound transformations happen in the quiet chambers of your own soul? If you have experienced this strange and often misunderstood calling toward solitude, if you have felt the weight of others questioning your withdrawal from the social world, then you are about to discover something that Manly P. Hall spent decades studying and teaching in the most sacred mystery schools of the Western tradition. What you are experiencing is not a flaw in your character, nor is it a sign of depression or antisocial behavior as the modern world might suggest. It is, in fact, one of the most ancient and universal signs that your consciousness is undergoing a profound metamorphosis, a transformation so complete that it requires you to temporarily step away from the external world to fully integrate what is happening within. The spiritually elevated individual, the true seeker of wisdom, has always walked a solitary path, not because they reject humanity, but because they understand that the deepest truths cannot be discovered in the marketplace of opinions and distractions. This understanding, this hidden truth about spiritual solitude, has been carefully guarded and transmitted through the ages by those who recognized that the journey inward is the most demanding and rewarding pilgrimage a human being can undertake. In the teachings of Manly P. Hall, we find a profound exploration of why those who advance on the spiritual path often find themselves naturally distancing from the crowds, from the superficial conversations, from the endless cycle of entertainment and distraction that characterizes modern existence. This is not about superiority or elitism, but about energetic alignment, and the simple fact that as your consciousness expands, your resonance with the ordinary world begins to shift in ways that are both liberating and challenging. Manly P. Hall taught that spiritual development follows natural laws just as physical growth does, and one of these laws is that the aspirant must periodically withdraw from external stimulation to allow the inner processes of transformation to complete themselves. Think of a caterpillar entering its cocoon, a necessary isolation where the most radical transformation in nature takes place, where the very structure of being is dissolved and reconstituted into something capable of flight. The spiritually developing individual experiences something remarkably similar, a process that the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the descent into the interior darkness where all that is false must be burned away before the gold of true consciousness can emerge. Hall explained that this process cannot happen while we are constantly engaged with the external world, constantly responding to its demands, constantly maintaining the masks and personas we have constructed to navigate social reality. The solitary period is not an escape from life, but a deeper engagement with life at its most fundamental level, a return to the source of consciousness itself, where the noise of the world cannot penetrate, and where the still small voice of inner wisdom can finally be heard. In the ancient mystery schools, initiates were often required to spend extended periods in isolation, in caves or temples, away from all familiar faces and voices, precisely because the teachers understood that transformation requires a crucible, a contained space where the heat of inner work can be concentrated and focused without dissipation. When we look at the great spiritual figures throughout history, we find this pattern repeated again and again. The Buddha left his palace and his family to sit alone beneath the Bodhi tree. Jesus withdrew into the desert for 40 days and nights before beginning his ministry. Muhammad received his revelations in a cave on Mount Hira, alone in contemplation. The Christian desert fathers and mothers fled the cities to live in caves and isolated cells in the Egyptian wilderness. Lao Tzu, according to legend, disappeared into the mountains to live in solitude. Rumi spent years in seclusion after the disappearance of his spiritual companion Shams. In every tradition, we find this recognition that spiritual elevation requires periods of withdrawal, not as a permanent state, but as a necessary phase in the cycle of development. Manly P. Hall emphasized that this withdrawal is often misunderstood by those who have not experienced it themselves, who see it as rejection or pride, when in reality it is an act of profound humility, a recognition that the work that needs to be done cannot be accomplished while maintaining the constant outward flow of energy that social life demands. The solitary individual is not running away from the world, but is gathering the strength and clarity that will eventually allow them to serve the world more effectively. to return with gifts of wisdom and understanding that can only be forged in the furnace of solitude. One of the most important insights Hall offered is that spiritual solitude is fundamentally different from loneliness. Loneliness is the painful awareness of separation, the feeling that we are cut off from connection and belonging. Spiritual solitude, by contrast, is the conscious choice to enter into relationship with the deeper dimensions of reality, with what Jung called the self, with what the mystics called the divine presence, with what philosophers called the ground of being. In true solitude, the spiritually developing individual discovers that they are never alone, that there is a companionship available in the depths of consciousness that is more real and more nourishing than any external relationship. This does not mean that external relationships become unimportant, or that the solitary individual becomes cold or indifferent, but rather that they discover a source of fulfillment that is not dependent on external validation or constant social stimulation. Hall taught that this inner companionship is what allows the spiritual adept to maintain equanimity and peace, even when external circumstances become chaotic or challenging, because they have discovered a center within themselves that remains untouched by the turbulence of the outer world. This is the secret that the hermits and mystics of all ages discovered in their caves and cells, that by withdrawing from the multiplicity of external distractions, they could establish a connection with the unity that underlies all existence, a connection so profound and so satisfying that the need for constant external stimulation simply falls away. The Hermetic tradition, which Hall studied extensively, teaches that as above so below, as within so without, meaning that the external world is a reflection of our internal state. When an individual begins to develop spiritually, their inner world becomes richer, more complex, more luminous, and consequently, the external world often begins to feel less substantial, less real, less capable of holding their attention. This is not because the external world has changed, but because their relationship to it has fundamentally shifted. What once seemed important now appears trivial. What once captured their interest now seems hollow. This transition can be deeply disorienting, especially in a culture that measures worth by external achievement and social popularity. But Hall assured his students that this disorientation is a sign of growth, not regression. The spiritually developing person is like an eagle learning to fly, awkward and uncertain at first as they adjust to a new relationship with gravity, with space, with perspective, but eventually discovering capabilities and views that were unimaginable from the ground-level perspective they once inhabited. The solitary period is when this adjustment happens, when the new capacities are integrated, when the individual learns to navigate the expanded territories of consciousness they now inhabit. Neste momento, quero fazer uma pausa e perguntar: você já sentiu esse estranho desconforto de estar em meio a multidões, mas sentir-se completamente sozinho? Ou, ao contrário, de estar fisicamente sozinho, mas experimentar uma plenitude e uma paz que nunca encontrou na companhia de outros? Essa inversão das experiências normais de solidão e companhia, onde o que deveria nos fazer sentir conectados nos deixa vazios, e o que deveria nos fazer sentir isolados, nos preenche com uma presença inexplicável. Se você está reconhecendo essa experiência agora, se está começando a entender que talvez seu afastamento das antigas formas de viver não seja um problema a ser corrigido, mas um chamado a ser honrado, compartilhe nos comentários apenas escrevendo: "O caminho é solitário", para que outros buscadores saibam que não estão sozinhos nessa jornada paradoxal. Às vezes, o simples reconhecimento de que outros estão passando pela mesma transformação pode ser o encorajamento que precisamos para continuar confiando no processo, mesmo quando ele nos leva para territórios desconhecidos. Seu comentário pode ser a luz que alguém precisava ver hoje para validar sua própria experiência. Agradeço sua coragem de compartilhar, de tornar visível o que tantos sentem, mas raramente expressam. Hall taught that one of the primary reasons spiritually advanced individuals become solitary is because they have developed a sensitivity to energy and vibration that makes casual social interaction genuinely exhausting. As consciousness refines, it becomes more perceptive, more attuned to subtle currents of emotion, intention, and thought that flow beneath the surface of ordinary conversation. The spiritually awakening person begins to feel the discord, the insincerity, the hidden agendas, the unconscious patterns that most people are completely unaware of but that nonetheless shape every social interaction. This is not about judgment or superiority, but about simple perception, like developing the ability to hear frequencies that others cannot detect. Just as a musician with perfect pitch might find it painful to listen to an out-of-tune orchestra, the spiritually sensitive individual can find ordinary social environments genuinely uncomfortable, not because they are better than others, but because they are perceiving dimensions of reality that create friction and dissonance. Hall emphasized that this sensitivity is a gift, a sign of development, but it is also a responsibility, requiring the individual to learn how to protect their energy, how to establish boundaries, how to discern when engagement is appropriate and when withdrawal is necessary. The solitary periods allow for recovery and recalibration, allowing the sensitive individual to discharge the accumulated energetic debris they have absorbed from interactions with the unconscious world, to return to their natural state of clarity and peace. In the mystery traditions that Hall devoted his life to studying and explaining, there is a concept called the path of the alone to the alone, the journey of the individuated soul toward union with the universal consciousness. This path cannot be walked in a crowd. It cannot be achieved by following the opinions and expectations of others. It requires what the existential philosophers called authentic existence, the courage to stand alone with one's own experience, to trust one's own perceptions even when they contradict the consensus reality, to follow the inner voice even when it leads away from the well-worn paths that society has designated as appropriate. Hall taught that this courage is rare and precious, that most people never develop it because the fear of isolation, the fear of being different, the fear of standing outside the protective circle of collective identity is too overwhelming. But for the spiritual aspirant, this fear must be faced and transcended, because the truth that is seeking to emerge through their consciousness cannot be contained within the conventional structures and beliefs that satisfy the majority. The solitary individual is not antisocial but presocial or transsocial, meaning they have not yet found or have moved beyond the forms of social organization that serve the mass consciousness, and they are in the process of discovering or creating new forms that can contain and express their expanded awareness. The alchemical texts that Hall translated and interpreted speak of a substance called the prima materia, the first matter, the raw material of transformation, and they teach that this substance can only be found by turning inward, by descending into what they called the cave of the heart, where the light of ordinary consciousness cannot reach. The outer world, in alchemical terms, is the realm of multiplicity, of endless diversity and distraction, while the inner world is the realm of unity, where all the scattered fragments of consciousness can be gathered and unified. The solitary period is when the alchemist enters the cave, seals the vessel, and begins the great work of inner transformation, the process of turning the lead of unconscious existence into the gold of enlightened awareness. This is not a metaphor, but a description of an actual psychological and spiritual process, a process that Jung later mapped in his concept of individuation, the journey toward wholeness that requires facing and integrating all the rejected and shadow aspects of the personality. This integration cannot happen while we are constantly projecting our inner content onto others, constantly avoiding our own darkness by staying busy with external activities, constantly seeking validation and identity from outside ourselves. The solitude forces us to confront what is actually present in our own consciousness, to see clearly the patterns and programs that have been running unconsciously, to take responsibility for our own inner state rather than blaming our discomfort on external circumstances. Hall pointed out that in every spiritual tradition, the advanced practitioner is often depicted in isolation, not surrounded by crowds of followers, but alone with the sacred, alone with the mystery, alone with the presence that cannot be captured in words or concepts. The Hermit card in the tarot, which Hall analyzed extensively, shows an old man standing alone on a mountain peak, holding a lantern that illuminates only his immediate surroundings, suggesting that true wisdom comes not from following the paths others have laid out, but from finding one's own way through the darkness, guided by the inner light that can only be discovered in solitude. The hermit has climbed above the valleys where the masses dwell, not out of pride but out of necessity, because the perspective needed to see truth clearly requires this elevation, this distance from the immediate concerns and conflicts that dominate life at lower altitudes. From the mountaintop, the hermit can see patterns and connections invisible from below, can understand the larger cycles and purposes that give meaning to the seemingly chaotic events of human life. This vision, this gnosis, cannot be purchased or borrowed. It must be earned through the difficult ascent, through the willingness to leave behind the comfort and security of the known world and venture into the unknown territories of consciousness. The great paradox that Hall emphasized repeatedly is that the individual who withdraws from the world in order to pursue spiritual development ultimately serves the world far more effectively than those who remain constantly engaged in worldly affairs. By doing the inner work, by transforming their own consciousness, the solitary practitioner becomes a channel for higher energies, for wisdom and compassion that can then flow through them to benefit others without the ego inflation and attachment to outcomes that characterizes most worldly helping. The bodhisattva in Buddhism, the saint in Christianity, the tzaddik in Judaism, the wali in Sufism, all represent this principle of the individual who has done the inner work and can now serve as a bridge between the transcendent and the immanent, between heaven and earth, between the absolute and the relative. But this bridging function only becomes possible after the period of withdrawal, after the journey into the depths, after the confrontation with one's own shadow, and the integration of the rejected aspects of the psyche. Without this inner work, service to others becomes contaminated with unconscious motives, with the need for recognition, with the desire to feel important or useful, with the subtle ways that the ego seeks to maintain and enlarge itself through good works. The contemporary world, with its emphasis on constant connectivity, on social media presence, on networking and visibility, makes the path of spiritual solitude more challenging than ever before, yet also more necessary. We are drowning in information but starving for wisdom, constantly stimulated but rarely satisfied, endlessly connected but profoundly isolated. The noise level has increased exponentially, making it almost impossible to hear the subtle voice of inner guidance, to feel the delicate movements of the soul, to sense the presence of the sacred that previous generations could still access in moments of quiet and stillness. The spiritually awakening individual in the modern world must therefore be even more deliberate and disciplined about creating the conditions for solitude, must consciously resist the cultural pressure to be constantly available, constantly producing, constantly consuming. This resistance is itself a spiritual practice, a form of sacred rebellion against the forces of distraction and dissipation that seek to colonize every moment of consciousness. Hall would likely say that the individuals who can maintain their center, who can preserve the sacred space of inner silence in the midst of contemporary chaos, are performing a service of incalculable value, holding open a doorway that might otherwise close completely, keeping alive the possibility of genuine spiritual development in an age that has largely forgotten what that even means. In the teachings of the mystery schools, there is a recognition that spiritual development happens in cycles, in rhythms of engagement and withdrawal, of activity and rest, of outer work and inner work. The solitary period is not meant to be permanent, but is rather a phase in the larger cycle, a necessary retreat that allows for integration and renewal before the next phase of engagement with the world. The spiritual master knows when to withdraw and when to engage, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait. This discernment comes from listening to the inner voice, from paying attention to the subtle energies that indicate whether a situation requires our presence or whether our withdrawal serves the greater good. Hall taught that many spiritual seekers make the mistake of believing that once they have achieved a certain level of understanding, they should immediately begin teaching or sharing what they have learned. But the wisdom traditions caution against premature expression. The fruit must ripen fully before it is picked. The wine must ferment completely before it is poured. The gold must be refined entirely before it is offered to the world. The solitary period allows for this ripening, this fermentation, this refinement, ensuring that what is eventually shared comes from genuine realization rather than from intellectual understanding or second-hand knowledge. There is a quality of presence that develops through sustained spiritual solitude, a depth and stillness that cannot be manufactured through techniques or practices, but emerges naturally when the constant outward flow of attention is redirected inward over an extended period. This quality is immediately recognizable to those who have developed it themselves, a kind of silent transmission that happens without words, a recognition of shared depths that transcends the need for explanation or justification. Hall spoke of this as the language of initiates, the unspoken understanding that passes between those who have walked the path and done the work, a communion that is more real and more intimate than any amount of conversation or social connection. This is why true spiritual community, when it does form, is often composed of individuals who each have their own deep relationship with solitude, who come together not out of neediness or lack, but out of a shared recognition and mutual support for the journey each is undertaking. Such communities are rare and precious precisely because they honor and protect the solitude that each member requires, understanding that the deepest connection happens not through constant interaction, but through the recognition of the same source dwelling in each heart. The fear of solitude that dominates contemporary culture is ultimately a fear of self, a fear of discovering what is actually present in our own consciousness, when all the distractions are removed, when all the masks are set aside, when all the stories we tell ourselves about who we are fall away. This fear keeps people trapped in patterns of compulsive socialization, constant entertainment, substance use, and endless activity, anything to avoid the confrontation with the naked reality of their own being. But Hall taught that this confrontation is precisely what the spiritual path demands, that we must be willing to face ourselves completely, to see clearly both the magnificence and the misery, the light and the darkness, the potential and the limitations that constitute our actual condition. This seeing is terrifying at first because it strips away all the comfortable illusions, all the flattering self-images, all the ways we have learned to hide from ourselves. But on the other side of this terror is a freedom and a peace that cannot be found anywhere else, a liberation that comes from no longer needing to maintain the exhausting pretense of being someone other than who we actually are. The solitary individual has passed through this terror and discovered this freedom, and consequently, they no longer need the constant validation and approval of others to feel okay, no longer need to compare themselves to others to establish their worth, no longer need to perform for the audience because they have found an audience of one that sees and accepts them completely. The ancient practice of retreat, which exists in virtually every spiritual tradition, is a formalized recognition of the necessity of solitude for spiritual development. Whether it is the vision quest of indigenous traditions, the monastic cell of Christianity, the cave retreat of Tibetan Buddhism, the Kalwa of Sufism, or the forest dwelling of Hindu ascetics, all these practices share the recognition that periodic withdrawal from ordinary life is essential for maintaining spiritual clarity and continuing development. Hall encouraged his students to create their own forms of retreat, to find ways of stepping out of the normal flow of obligations and distractions, even if only for a day or a weekend, to taste the quality of consciousness that becomes available when we stop doing and simply be, when we cease the constant effort to maintain our place in the social world, and allow ourselves to dissolve into the larger consciousness that is always present but rarely noticed. These retreats need not be elaborate or exotic. They can happen in one's own home, in a park, in any space where we can be alone with ourselves and the sacred without interruption. What matters is not the location but the intention, the willingness to turn away from the external and turn toward the internal, to prioritize the relationship with the deeper dimensions of reality over the maintenance of worldly appearances and accomplishments. Se você também busca compreender os mistérios da sua própria consciência e deseja continuar esta jornada de autodescoberta, este canal é um espaço sagrado onde exploramos juntos as verdades ancestrais que podem iluminar seu caminho interior. A cada semana, compartilhamos reflexões profundas e ensinamentos que têm ajudado inúmeras almas a encontrar clareza em momentos de confusão espiritual, a reconhecer que o chamado para a solidão não é um fardo, mas uma bênção disfarçada, um convite para descobrir tesouros internos que jamais poderiam ser encontrados no barulho do mundo exterior. Inscreva-se para receber estes lembretes de sabedoria, que podem ser exatamente o que sua alma precisa ouvir nos momentos de maior desafio, quando o caminho parece impossível de continuar sozinho. Esta comunidade de buscadores da verdade está aqui para caminhar ao seu lado, respeitando profundamente o espaço sagrado da sua solidão, enquanto oferecemos o apoio invisível mais real de outros que compreendem a jornada que você está percorrendo. Agradeço profundamente por você ter dedicado seu precioso tempo e atenção a esta exploração, e espero sinceramente poder continuar sendo parte da sua evolução espiritual, honrando tanto os momentos em que você precisa estar completamente sozinho, quanto aqueles raros e preciosos instantes em que almas afins se reconhecem mutuamente no silêncio compartilhado. The hidden truth about spiritually elevated solitary individuals that Manly P. Hall illuminated throughout his extraordinary life and work is simply this. They are not fleeing from life, but are engaging with life at its deepest level, not avoiding responsibility, but are taking on the ultimate responsibility of consciousness development, not indulging in selfishness, but are performing the most selfless act possible, which is the transformation of their own being into a clearer vessel for truth, beauty, and goodness to manifest in the world. Their solitude is not rejection but discernment, not coldness but the most refined form of warmth, concentrated and directed toward the fire of transformation, rather than dissipated in the lukewarm waters of casual connection. If you have felt the call to solitude, if you have experienced the mysterious pull away from the world and toward the depths of your own consciousness, know that you are in the company of every great soul who has ever walked this earth, every saint and sage, every mystic and philosopher who understood that the kingdom of heaven is within, that the pearl of great price can only be found by diving deep into the ocean of the self, that the philosopher's stone that transmutes all suffering into wisdom can only be discovered in the secret laboratory of the solitary heart. Trust the process, honor the calling, protect the sacred space of your inner work, and know that even in the deepest solitude, you are never truly alone, for you are accompanied by the eternal presence that dwells at the center of all consciousness, the divine spark that is seeking to awaken fully through your individual journey. The path is indeed solitary, but it is also the most populated path in existence, walked by countless beings across all times and places, all moving in the same direction, toward the light that never dims, toward the love that never fails, toward the peace that passes all understanding.